hadn't been singed. She had seen that body herself. These incidents weren't caused by the ghosts, but the people had begun to blame the apparitions. Better than blaming Rand, she supposed. This waiting in the city, it is frustrating, Maurice continued. Our time in this city does seem to lack fruit, Curiel agreed. We should be moving on. You've heard that he is proclaiming that the last battle will begin soon. Nynaeve felt a stab of worry for Lan, then anger toward Rand. He still thought that if he could stage his assault at the same time as Lan's attack on Tarwin's Gap, he could confuse his enemies. Lan's attack could very well be the beginning of the last battle. Why then wouldn't Rand commit troops to help? Yes, Cadsuane said musingly. He is probably right. Why did she keep that hood up? Rand obviously wasn't around. Then we have all the greater reason to move on, Maurice said sternly. Rand al'Thor, he is a fool, and Arad Doman, it is irrelevant. A king or no king, what does it matter? The Seanchan are not irrelevant, Nynaeve said, sniffing. What of them? You would have us march to the Blight and leave our kingdoms open to invasion? Maurice didn't react. Curiel smiled and shrugged, then looked toward Donner Flynn, who leaned against the wall behind them, his arms folded. The leathery old man's casual posture suggested that he saw the procession of ghosts as nothing special, and these days he might be right. Nynaeve looked back out at the ghost procession, who were walking in an arc, rounding the city wall. The other Aes Sedai resumed their conversation, Maurice and Curiel taking further opportunity to voice their displeasure with Rand in their separate ways, one dour, the other congenial. It made Nynaeve want to defend him. Though he had been difficult and erratic lately, there was important work for him to do in Arad Doman. The meeting with the Seanchan in Falma was only a short time away. Beyond that, Rand was right to worry about filling the Domani throne. And what if Grendal really was here, as he seemed to think? The others thought he must be mistaken about the Forsaken, but Rand had discovered Forsaken in nearly every other kingdom. Why not Arad Doman? A missing king? A land seething with confusion, famine, and strife? These things sounded exactly like the kinds of trouble one would discover near one of the Forsaken. The others continued to talk. Nynaeve started to leave, and as she did so, she noticed that Cadsuane was watching her. Nynaeve hesitated, turning toward the cloaked woman. Cadsuane's face was barely visible by torchlight, but Nynaeve caught a grimace in the shadows, as if Cadsuane were displeased with Maurice's and Curiel's complaints. Nynaeve and Cadsuane stared at each other for a moment, then Cadsuane nodded curtly. The aged Aes Sedai turned and began to walk away, right in the middle of one of Maurice's tirades about Rand. The other Aes Sedai bustled to catch up. What had that look been for? Cadsuane had a habit of treating other Aes Sedai as if they were less worthy of respect than a common mule. It was as if all the rest of them were mere children in her eyes. But, well, considering the way many Aes Sedai had been acting lately... Frowning to herself, Nynaeve left in the other direction, nodding to the wall guard. That nod of Cadsuane's couldn't possibly have been given out of respect. Cadsuane was far too self-righteous and arrogant for that. What to do about Rand, then? He didn't want Nynaeve's help, or anyone's help, but that was nothing new. He'd been just as stubborn as a sheep herder back in the Two Rivers, and his father had been nearly as bad. That had never stopped Nynaeve the Wisdom, so it certainly wouldn't stop Nynaeve the Aes Sedai. She'd wrangled Coplans and Congars. She could do the same for trumped-up Rand al'Thor. She had half a mind to stride to his new palace and give him an earful. Except Rand al'Thor wasn't just any Coplin or Congar. Stubborn folks back in the Two Rivers hadn't had Rand's strangely menacing aura. She'd dealt with dangerous men before. Her own Lan was as dangerous as a wolf on the prowl, and could be as prickly too, even if he was good at hiding it from most people. But as threatening and as intimidating as Lan could be, He'd sooner chop off his own hand than linger to harm her. Rand was different. Nynaeve reached the steps leading off the wall into the city and headed down them, waving away a guard's suggestion that she take one of them in escort. It was night, and there were a lot of refugees about, but she was hardly helpless. She did accept a lantern from another guard, however. Using the one power to craft light would make the passers-by uncomfortable. Rand. Once she'd thought him as gentle as land. His devotion to protecting women had been almost laughable in its innocence. That Rand was gone. Nynaeve saw again the moment when he'd exiled Cadsuane. She'd believed that he would kill Cadsuane if he saw her face again, and thinking of the moment still gave her shivers. Surely it had been her imagination, but the room had seemed to darken distinctly at that moment, as if a cloud had passed over the sun. Rand al'Thor had grown unpredictable. His explosion of temper at Nynaeve herself a few days ago was just another example. Of course, he would never exile or threaten her, despite what he had said. It wasn't that hard, was he? She reached the bottom of the stone steps, walking out onto a boardwalk stained with the mud of evening traffic. She pulled her shawl close. Huddled people clustered on the other side of the street. The shop entrances and alleyways there offered protection from the wind. She heard a child's cough among a distant group. She froze, then heard the cough again. It was not an easy sound. Muttering, she crossed the street, then forced her way through the refugees, holding up her lantern to illuminate one group of drowsy people after another. Many had the coppery skin of the Damani, but there were a fair number of Taraboners as well. And were those Saldeans? That was unexpected. Most of the refugees lay in ragged blankets next to their meager possessions, a pot here, a quilt there. One young girl had a small cloth doll that might have once been fine, but had now lost one of its arms. Rand certainly was effective at subduing countries, but his kingdoms needed more than just handouts of grain. They needed stability, and they needed something, someone they could believe in. Rand was getting increasingly bad at offering either one. Where was the source of that cough? Few of the refugees spoke to her, and they were hesitant to answer her questions. When she finally found the boy, she was more than a little annoyed. His parents had made their beds in a hollow between two wooden shops, and as Nynaeve approached, the father stood up to confront her. He was a scruffy Damani with a dark, ragged beard and a thick mustache that might have once been trimmed to Damani fashion. He wore no coat, and his shirt was nearly in tatters. Nynaeve stared him down with a look she had learned long before her days as an Aes Sedai. Honestly, men could be so foolish. His son was likely dying, and yet he confronted one of the few people in the city who could help. The wife had more sense, which was usually the case. She laid a hand on her husband's leg, causing him to glance down. He finally turned away with a quiet mutter. The wife's features were difficult to see through the grime on her face. The dirt was streaked with tear lines on her cheeks. She had obviously had a difficult couple of nights. Nynaeve knelt, ignoring the looming father, then pulled back the blanket from the face of the child in the woman's arms. Sure enough, he was gaunt and pale, and his eyes fluttered open in some delusion. "How long has he been coughing?" Nynaeve said, pulling a few packets of herbs out of the pouch at her side. She didn't have much, but they would have to do. "A week now, lady," the woman replied. Nynaeve tisked in annoyance, pointing toward a nearby tin cup. "Fill that," she snapped at the father. "You are lucky the boy has survived this long with the white shakes. He likely wouldn't live the night without intervention." Despite his earlier reluctance, the father hastened to obey, filling the cup from a nearby barrel. At least there wasn't a lack of water here, with the frequent rains. Nynaeve took the cup and mixed the asum and feverbane in it, then wove a thread of fire and heated the water. It started steaming faintly, and the father muttered some more. Nynaeve shook her head. She'd always heard that the Damani were pragmatic people when it came to use of the one power. The unrest in the city must really be getting to them. Drink, she said to the boy, kneeling down and using all 5 powers in a complex wave of healing that she used instinctively. Her ability had awed some of the other Aes Sedai, but had earned her scorn from others. Either way, her method worked, even if she couldn't explain how she did what she did. That was one of the blessings and the curses of being a Wilder. She could do things by instinct that other Aes Sedai struggled to learn. However, it was difficult for Nynaeve to unlearn some of the bad habits she'd learned. The boy, though dazed, responded to the cup pressed to his lips. Her healing weave lay across him as he drank, and he stiffened, inhaling sharply. The herbs weren't needed, but they would help give him strength following the rigorous healing. She'd gotten over her habit of always using herbs when healing, but she still felt they had their place and usefulness. The father knelt down threateningly, but Nynaeve pressed the tips of her fingers to his chest and forced him back. Give the child air. The boy blinked, and Nynaeve could see sense flood back into his eyes. He shivered weakly. Nynaeve delved him to determine how well the healing had worked. The fever has broken, she said with a nod, standing and releasing the one power. He will need to eat well over the next few days. I will give your descriptions to the dock masters, and you will receive extra rations. Do not sell the food, or I will find out and I will be angry. Do you understand? The woman looked down, ashamed. We would never. I don't take anything for granted anymore, Nynaeve said. Anyway, he should live if you do as I say. Feed him the rest of that draft tonight by sips, if you have to. If the fever starts again, bring him to me at the Dragon's Palace. Yes, my lady, the woman said as the husband knelt, taking the boy and smiling. Nynaeve picked up her lantern and rose. Lady, the woman said, thank you. Nynaeve turned back. You should have brought him to me days ago. I don't care what foolish superstitions people are spreading. The Aes Sedai are not your enemies. If you know any who are sick, encourage them to visit us. The woman nodded, and the husband seemed cowed. Nynaeve stalked out of the alleyway and back onto the dark street, passing folk who watched her with a mixture of awe and horror. Foolish people. Would they let their own children die rather than get them healed? Back on the street, Nynaeve calmed herself. The diversion really hadn't taken much of her time, and, tonight at least, time was one of the things she had plenty of. She wasn't having much luck dealing with Rand. Her only consolation was that Cadsuane had done worse as his advisor. How did one handle a creature like the Dragon Reborn? Nynaeve knew that the old Rand was there, within him somewhere. He had simply been beaten and kicked so many times that he'd gone into hiding, letting this harsher version rule. As much as it galled her to admit it, bullying him was just not going to work. But how was she to get him to do what he should, since he was too bullheaded to respond to ordinary prodding? Nynaeve halted, lantern light illuminating an empty street before her. There was one person who had managed to work with Rand, while at the same time teaching and training him. It hadn't been Cadsuane, nor had it been any of the Aes Sedai who tried to capture him, trick him, or bully him. It had been Moiraine. Nynaeve continued on her way. During the last months of her life, the Blue had all but fawned over Rand. In order to get him to take her as his advisor, she'd agreed to obey his commands and offer advice only when it was wanted. What good was advice when it was given only when it was wanted? People needed most to hear the advice they didn't want. But Moiraine had been successful. Through her, Rand had begun to overcome his aversion to Aes Sedai. Without Rand's eventual acceptance of Moiraine, it was doubtful that Cadsuane would ever have made headway in becoming his counselor. Well, Nynaeve wasn't about to act the same way for Rand al'Thor, no matter how many fancy titles he had. However, she did have something to learn from Moiraine's success. Perhaps Rand had listened to Moiraine because her subservience had flattered him. Or maybe he had simply been tired of people pushing him around. Rand did have many people trying to control him. They must frustrate him, and they made Nynaeve's own job a lot more difficult, since she was the one that he actually needed to listen to. Did he perhaps see her simply as another of those irrelevant manipulators? She wouldn't put it past him. She needed to show him that they were working for the same goals. She didn't want to tell him what to do. She just wanted him to stop acting like a fool. And beyond that, she just wanted him to be safe. She'd also like him to be a leader that people respected, not one that people feared. He seemed incapable of seeing that the path he was on was that of a tyrant. Being a king really wasn't all that different from being mayor in the Two Rivers. The mayor needed to be respected and liked. The wisdom in the women's circle could do the difficult tasks, such as punishing those who overstep their bounds. The mayor, however, needed to be loved. That led to a civil and a safe town. But how to show that to Rand? She couldn't force him. She needed to get him to listen to her in another way. A plan began to take root in her head. By the time she reached the mansion, she had an idea of what to do. The gate to the mansion grounds was guarded by Saldeans. The Aiel preferred to stay closer to Rand, watching the rooms and the hallways of the mansion itself. Pastor Nalmat, the officer on duty, gave Nynaeve a bow as she approached. Some people still knew how to treat Aes Sedai. The grounds beyond the gate were ornamental and cultivated. Nynaeve's lantern cast strange shadows on the grass as its light shone through the trees trained and trimmed in the shapes of fanciful animals. The shadows moved in concert with her lantern, the phantom shapes lengthening and merging with the greater blackness of the night around her, like rivers of shadow. A larger group of Saldean soldiers stood guard at the front of the mansion, far more than were necessary. Whenever men stood on guard, their friends tended to gather, no doubt to gossip. Nynaeve strode up to the group, causing several of them to stop leaning lazily against the mansion's gallery of pillars. "Who of you are not on duty right now?" she asked. Sure enough, 3 of the 9 soldiers raised their hands, looking somewhat sheepish. "Excellent," Nynaeve said, handing her lantern to one of them. "You 3 come with me." She strode into the mansion, the 3 soldiers scrambling in behind. It was late. The ghost procession appeared only at midnight, and the mansion slumbered. The intricate chandelier in the entryway had been extinguished, and the hallways were dark. Testing her memory, she picked a direction and walked down it. The whitewashed walls were as immaculate here as they were in other sections of the mansion, but they were unornamented. Her instincts proved correct as she soon entered a small pantry where servants would prepare platters of food before taking them to the dining room. The hallway she had chosen led out to the mansion's sitting rooms. Another hallway at the back led to the kitchens. The room was furnished with a big, sturdy wooden table and some tall stools. Those were occupied by a group of men playing a game of dice, wearing green and white linen shirts, the livery of Milisair's house, with thick work trousers. They looked up with shock as Nynaeve strode into the room. One of the men actually leaped to his feet, his stool toppling to the floor behind him. He pulled off his hat, a lopsided brown thing that even Matt would have been embarrassed to wear, looking like a child caught poking his finger into the pie before dinner. Nynaeve didn't care what they were doing. She'd found some servants of the mansion, and that was all that mattered. "I must see the Dosen," she said, using the local term for the head housekeeper. "Fetch her for me." Her soldiers entered the room behind her. All 3 were Saldeans, and if they were somewhat oafish, they walked with the swaggers of men who intimately understood fighting. She doubted that these simple servants needed any more intimidation than an Aes Sedai, but the soldiers would likely prove useful later. "The Dosen?" the worker with the hat finally said. "Are you sure you wouldn't rather see the steward or—" "The Dosen," Nynaeve said. "Bring her to me now. Give her time to throw on a robe, but no more." She pointed at one of her soldiers. "You go with him. Make sure he doesn't speak to anyone else or give the woman a chance to escape." "Escape?" the worker yelped. Why would Laral want to do that? What did she do, my lady? Nothing, I hope. Go. The two men, one worker, one soldier, hurried off, and the other three workers remained at the table looking uncomfortable. Nynaeve folded her arms beneath her breasts, considering her plan. Rand had determined that his hunt for the Damani king had hit a wall with the death of the messenger. Nynaeve wasn't so certain. There were others involved.
Hey, Soy,
and
how
a
you
few
doing?
well-placed questions might be very
You
illuminating.
know what? Since you're here,
It was
let's
unlikely
do
the
a
Dothan
dab.
had done anything wrong, but Nynaeve did not want the worker who fetched her letting his tongue wag to the people he might meet along the way. Better to instill into him a sense of danger and use the soldier to keep him quiet, not to mention punctual.
How's your evening or
Her
day
foresight
going,
proved
Soy?
effective. Within minutes, the worker hurried back into the room, showing a disheveled elderly woman in a blue evening robe. Gray hair poked out from beneath her hastily wrapped red kerchief, and her aging Damani face was absolutely white with apprehension. Nynaeve felt guilty. How this woman must feel, awoken at night by a terrified servant claiming that one of the Aes Sedai wanted her immediately. The Saldean soldier followed, then stood guard beside the doorway. He was bow-legged and squat, and he wore one of those long Saldean mustaches. The other two lounged beside the doorway Nynaeve had come through, their casual air only serving to make the room more tense. They picked up on something of her intent, it seemed. Peace, good woman, Nynaeve said, nodding to the table. You may sit. You others go to the main entryway and stay there. Don't speak to anyone. The four workers needed no further prodding. Nynaeve told one of the soldiers to follow them and make certain they did as she said. The late hour was working to her advantage. With so many of the servants and Rand's attendants asleep, she could investigate without alerting those who might be guilty. The departure of the workers only made the dose.
It's some live rosin sugar
Nynaeve
wax.
sat at the table on one of the vacated stools. The men had left their dice behind in their haste, but had, of course, made sure to take their coins. The room was lit by a small lamp, burning with an open flame on the windowsill. The Saldean had taken her lantern with him when following the workers. Your name is Laral, is it not? Nynaeve asked. The Dosen nodded wearily. You are aware that Aes Sedai do not lie? The housekeeper nodded again. Most Aes Sedai couldn't lie, though Nynaeve technically could, since she hadn't held the oath rod. That was part of what earned her a lesser status in the eyes of the others, undeservedly so. The oath rod was only a formality. Two Rivers folk needed no ter'angreal to make them honest. Then you will believe me when I tell you that I do not suspect you personally of having done anything wrong. I just need your help. The woman seemed to relax a bit. What help do you need, Nynaeve Sedai? It has been my experience that the head housekeeper knows more of a house's workings than the stewards, or even the owners of the property. Have you been employed here for long? I have served the Chadmar family through 3 generations, the old woman said, with no small measure of pride, and had hoped to see her ladyship Rand had her ladyship in her own brain. That didn't bode well for the generation to serve. Yes, well, Nynaeve said, covering the uncomfortable silence. The unfortunate circumstances involving your lady are part of my task this evening.
Take another drink and I'll take the rest of that.
The aged woman said, growing
So I had to put it out
Do you suppose you can see
out
her
of Lord
to
Tent because
restore her to the Lord Dragon's good graces?
of the type of wax it is.
Doubtfully, Nynaeve added in her mind, but anything is possible. My activities tonight may help. Did you ever see this messenger? The one your mistress imprisoned? The one sent by the king? Laral asked. I never spoke with him, Aes Sedai, but I did see him. Tall, handsome, curiously clean-shaven for a Damani man. I passed him in the hallway. Had one of the most beautiful faces I rightly think I've ever seen on a man. And then, Nynaeve asked, well, he asked me to speak with Lady Chadmar, and then Laurel trailed off. Nynaeve, said I don't mean to be getting my lady into any more trouble, and he was sent for questioning, Nynaeve said shortly. I have little time for foolishness, Laurel. I am not here looking for evidence against your mistress, and I don't really care what your loyalties are. There are much larger issues at stake. Answer my question. Yes, lady, Laurel said, paling. Bill knew what had happened. It didn't seem right, sending one of the king's men to a questioner like that. Particularly that man, Shane.
Okay, let's get one more drink, then we'll finish that
You
dab
know the
off.
location of the questioner and the dungeon? Laurel hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Good. She didn't intend to withhold information. Let us go, then, Nynaeve said, rising. My lady? To the dungeon, Nynaeve said. I assume it isn't on the property anywhere. Not if Minister Chadmar was as careful as I think. It's a modest distance away from the feast, Laurel said. You wish to go tonight? Yes, Nynaeve said, then hesitated. Unless I decide to visit the questioner at his home instead. They are the same place, my lady. Excellent. Come. Laurel didn't have much choice. Nynaeve allowed her, guarded by a soldier, to return to her usual dress. A short time later, Nynaeve and her soldiers left the bosun, along with the four, to keep them from accidentally getting warned of what was happening in the building. All five looked decidedly displeased. They probably believed the superstitious rumors that the night was not safe. Nynaeve knew better. The night might not be safe, but it wasn't any worse than other times. In fact, it might be safer. If there were fewer people about, there were fewer chances of someone nearby suddenly growing thorns out of their skin, bursting into flame, or dying in a horribly random way. They left the mansion, Nynaeve walking with a firm step, hoping to keep the others from feeling too nervous. She nodded to the soldiers at the gate and went in the direction Laurel indicated. Their feet thumped against the wood of the boardwalk, the clouded night sky glowing just faintly from moonlight above. Nynaeve didn't give herself the luxury of questioning her plan. She'd decided on a course, and so far it was going well. True, Rand might grow angry at her for appropriating soldiers and stirring up trouble. But sometimes, to see what was at the bottom of a cloudy rain barrel, you needed to stir the water to bring up what was at the bottom. It was just too coincidental. Milasair Chadmar had taken the messenger captive months ago, but he had died only a short time before Rand wanted him. He was the only person in the city with a clue to the king's location. Coincidences did happen. Sometimes, when two farmers were feuding and one of their cows died in the night, it was just an accident. And sometimes a little searching uncovered the opposite. Laurel led the group toward the Gull's Feast. The Gull District, a part of town close to where the fishermen dumped waste from their hauls. Like most sensible people, Nynaeve avoided that section of town, and her nose reminded her just why as they approached. Fish guts might make excellent fertilizer, but Nynaeve could smell the composting heaps from several streets away. Even the refugees avoided this dark area. The walk was a fairly long one. Understandably, the rich sector of town was distant from the Gull's Feast. Nynaeve stalked along, paying no heed to the shadowed alleyways and buildings, though her entourage, soldiers excepted, clustered around her apprehensively. The Saldaeans instead kept their hands on their serpentine swords, trying to look in all directions at once. She wished she had news from the White Tower. How long had it been since she'd had news from Egwene or one of the others? She felt blind. It was her own fault for insisting that she go with Rand. Someone had needed to keep an eye on him, but that meant being unable to keep any eyes on everyone else. Was the tower still divided? Was Egwene still Amarlin? News on the streets was little help. As always, for every rumor she heard, there were two more contradicting it. The White Tower was fighting itself. No, it fought the Ashaman. No, the Aes Sedai had been destroyed by the Shan-Shan or by the Dragon Reborn. No, those rumors were all lies spread by the tower to bait its enemies into striking. Very little was said about Elida or Egwene specifically, though garbled news of two Amerlins was spreading. That
Now back
was
to the boat.
problematic. Neither group of Aes Sedai would like spreading the news of a second mission. Tales of squabbles among the Aes Sedai would only end up hurting all of them. Eventually, Loral stopped walking. The four workers stopped behind her, bundling together with worried expressions. Nynaeve glanced at Loral. Well? There, lady. The woman pointed a bony finger to the building across the street. The chandler's shop? Nynaeve asked. Loral nodded. Nynaeve summoned one of the bow-legged Saldean soldiers. You, watch these five and make sure they don't get into trouble. You other two, come with me. She started across the street, but when she didn't hear footsteps leave the boardwalk, she turned with a frown. The three guards stood together looking at a single lantern, likely cursing themselves for not thinking to bring another. Oh, for the light's sake, Nynaeve snapped, raising her hand and embracing the source. She wove a globe of light above her fingers, casting a cool, even illumination across the ground around her. Leave the lantern. The two Saldeans complied, hurrying after her. She stepped up to the chandler's door, then wove a ward against eavesdropping and placed it in the air around herself, the door, and the two soldiers. She looked at one of the soldiers. What's your name? Triben, my lady, he said. He was a hawk-faced man with a short, trimmed mustache and a scar across his forehead. That's Lurtz, he said, pointing at the other soldier, a massive wall of a man, who Nynaeve had been surprised to see was uniformed as a cavalryman. All right, Triben, Nynaeve said. Kick the door open. Triben didn't question her. He just raised a booted foot and kicked. The frame cracked easily and the door slammed open, but if her ward had been placed correctly, nobody in the building would be able to hear. She peeked in. The room smelled of wax and perfumes, and the wooden floor was marked by numerous spots. Drip marks. Wax that had been cleaned up often left a mark. Quickly, she said to the soldiers, releasing the ward but maintaining the globe of light. Lurtz, go to the back of the shop and watch the alley. Make certain nobody escapes. Triben, with me. Lurtz moved with surprising speed for his bulk, taking his position in the back room of the shop. Her globe illuminated barrels for dipping candles and a pile of burned nubs in the corner, bought for pennies to be remelted. A staircase mounted to the right. A small alcove in the front of the shop was the storefront, and it contained various sizes and shapes of candles, from the standard white rod to the perfumed and decorated brick. If Loral was wrong about this being the place, but any good secret operation would have a working front. Nynaeve hurried up the stairs, wood creaking beneath her weight. The building was narrow. On the upper floor, she and Triben found two rooms. One door was open a crack, so Nynaeve dimmed her globe of light and wove a ward against listeners into the room. Then she burst in, hawk-faced Triben following, his sword scraping against its scabbard as he pulled it free. There was only one person in the room, an overweight man sleeping on a mattress on the floor, blankets in a heap around his feet. Nynaeve wove a few threads of air, tying him up in one smooth motion. His eyes bulged open and he opened his mouth to scream, but Nynaeve stuffed air between his lips, gagging him. She turned to Triben and nodded, tying off her weaves. They left the bound man there, struggling against his bonds, and crossed to the other door. She wove another weave against eavesdropping into the room, and it was a good thing she did, for the two younger men in this room roused much more quickly. One sat bolt upright, letting out a yelp, just as Triben headed across the floorboards. Triben punched him in the stomach, knocking the air out of his lungs. Nynaeve bound him with a thread of air, then did the same for the other young man, who was rousing drowsily in his bunk. She towed the two toward her, brightening her globe of light, hanging the men up in the air a few inches. They were both Damani, with dark hair and crude faces, thin mustaches above their lips. Both wore only their small clothes. They seemed too old to be apprentices. I think we have the right place, Nynaeve Sedai, Triben said, walking around the pair to stand beside her. She raised an eyebrow at him. Those are no Chandler's apprentices, Triben continued. He slid his sword back into its sheath. Calluses on the palms, but no burns on their hands. Muscled arms, and they're far too old. That fellow on the left has had his nose broken at least once. She looked closer. Triben was right. I should have seen that. Still, she had noticed the age. Which one do you think I should ungag? She asked casually. And which one should I kill? Both men began to squirm, eyes wide. They should have known that an Aes Sedai would never do anything of the sort. In fact, she probably shouldn't have implied it, but private jailers like these riled her anger. The one on the left seems most eager to talk, lady, Triben said. Perhaps he will tell you what you wish to know. She nodded, releasing the man's gag. He began to speak immediately. I will do whatever you say. Please, don't fill my stomach with insects. I haven't done anything wrong, I promise you. She stuffed the air gag back in. Too much complaining, she said. Perhaps the other will know to hush and speak when spoken to. She released his gag. This man remained dangling in the air, obviously terrified, but saying nothing. The one power could unnerve the most hardened of killers. How do I get into the dungeon? She asked this man. He looked sick, but he had probably already guessed that she'd want the dungeon. It was unlikely that an Aes Sedai would burst into the shop after midnight because she'd been sold a bad candle. Trapdoor, the man said, under the rug in the shop front. Excellent, Nynaeve said. She tied off the weaves binding the men's hands, then replaced the gag on the one who had spoken. She didn't leave them hanging in the air. She didn't want to have to pull them along behind her, and instead let them walk on their own feet. She had Triben fetch the overweight man from the other room, then herded all three down the stairs. Below, they met the muscular Lurtz, keeping careful watch on the alley out back. A youth sat on the floor in front of him, and Nynaeve's globe of light illuminated his face, a frightened Damani one, with uncharacteristically light hair and hands spotted with burns. Now that's a Chandler's apprentice, Triben said, scratching his forehead scar. They probably have him doing all of the work for the front. He was asleep under those blankets over there. Lurtz nodded to a shadowed pile of Tried to scramble out the front door after you went up the stairs. Bring him, Nynaeve said. In the small storefront, Triben pulled back the rug, then used the edge of his sword to prod through the slats until he knocked against something underneath. Hinges, Nynaeve assumed. After a little careful prying, he got the trapdoor open. A ladder reached down into the darkness below. Nynaeve stepped forward, but Triben held up a hand. Lord Bashir would hang me up by my own stirrups if I let you go first, lady, he said. No telling what might be down there. He leaped into the hole, sliding down the ladder with one hand, his sword in the other. He thumped to the ground below, and Nynaeve rolled her eyes. Men. She gestured for Lurtz to watch the jailers, then released their bonds so they could climb down. She gave each of them a stern look. Then she proceeded down the ladder without Triben's ridiculous flair, leaving Lurtz to herd the jailers after. She raised her globe of light and surveyed the cellar. The walls were stone, which made her feel much less nervous about the weight of the building above. The floor was packed dirt, and there was a wooden doorway built into the wall across from her. Triben was listening at it. She nodded, and he pulled it open, darting inside eagerly. The Saldeans seemed to be picking up some bad habits from the Aiel. Nynaeve followed, preparing weaves of air just in case. Behind her, the sullen jailers began to climb down the ladder. There wasn't much to see in the other room. 2 dungeon cells with thick wooden doors, a table with some stools beside it, and a large wooden trunk. Nynaeve sent her globe of light to the corner as hawk-faced Triben inspected the trunk. He lifted the lid and raised an eyebrow, pulling out several glittering knives. Aids for questioning. Nynaeve shivered. She turned harsh eyes on the jailers behind her. She untied the gag on the one who had spoken. Keys? She asked. Bottom of the trunk, said the thug. The overweight jailer, the leader of the group, no doubt, as he didn't share a room, shot him a furious glance. Nynaeve jerked the leader into the air. Don't provoke me, she growled. It's already far too late at night for reasonable people to be awake. She nodded to Triben, and he dug out the keys and opened the cell doors. The first cell was empty. The second one held a disheveled woman, still wearing a fine Damani dress, though it was soiled. Lady Chadmar was dirty and ragged, and she curled against the wall, drowsy, barely even noticing that the door was open. Nynaeve caught a whiff of a stench that, up until that moment, had been covered by the scent of rotting fish, human excrement, and an unwashed body. Likely that was one reason for locating the dungeon here in the Gull's Feast. Nynaeve inhaled sharply at seeing how the woman was being treated. How could Rand allow this? The woman herself had done this very thing to others, but that didn't make it right for him to stoop to her level. She waved for Triben to close the door. Then she sat down on one of the room's stools, regarding the three jailers. Behind, Lurtz guarded the way out, keeping an eye on the poor apprentice. The overweight jailer still hung in the air. She needed information. She could have asked Rand for permission to visit the jail in the morning, but in doing so, she would have risked alerting these men that they were going to be visited. She was depending on surprise and intimidation to reveal what had been hidden. Now, she said to the three, I am going to ask some questions. You are going to answer. I'm not certain what I'm going to do with you yet, so realize it's best to be very honest with me. The two on the ground looked up at the other man, floating in the invisible weaves of air. They nodded. The man who was brought to you, she said. The messenger of the king. When did he first arrive? 2 months ago, one of the toughs said. The one with the large chin and the broken nose. Arrived in a sack with the candle nubs from Lady Chadmar's mansion, just like all the prisoners. Your instructions? Hold him, the other tough said. Keep him alive. We didn't know much, Lady Aes Sedai. Jorgen is the one who does all the questioning. She looked up at the fat man. You're Jorgen? He nodded reluctantly. And what were your instructions? Jorgen didn't respond. Nynaeve sighed. Look, she said to him. I'm Aes Sedai, and am bound by my word. If you tell me what I want to know, I will see that you are not suspected in the death. The dragon doesn't care about you three. Otherwise, you wouldn't still be here in charge of this little stopover of yours. If we talk, we go free, the fat man said, eyeing her. Your word? Nynaeve glanced about the tiny room with a dissatisfied eye. They had left Lady Chadmar in the dark, and the door was packed with cloth to muffle screams. The cell would be dark, stuffy, and cramped. Men who would work a place like this barely deserved life, let alone freedom. But there was a much larger sickness to deal with. Yes, Nynaeve said, the word bitter in her mouth. And you know that's better than you deserve. Jorgen hesitated, then nodded. Let me down, Aes Sedai, and I'll answer your questions. She did so. The man might not know it, but she had very little authority to stand on. She wouldn't resort to his methods of extracting answers, and she was acting without Rand's knowledge. The dragon probably wouldn't react well when he discovered that she'd been crying, not unless she could present him with discoveries. Jorgen said to the broken-nosed thug, Mord, fetch me a stool. Mord glanced at Nynaeve for approval, which she gave with a curt nod. As Jorgen settled his bulk onto the stool, he leaned forward, hands clasped before him. He resembled a hulking beetle tipped up on its side. I don't see what you need from me, the man said. You seem to know everything already. You know about my facility and about the people it has held. What more is there to know? Facility? Some word for it. That is my own business, Nynaeve said, giving him a stare which she hoped implied that the concerns of the Aes Sedai were not to be questioned. Tell me, how did the messenger die? Without dignity, Jordan replied. Like all men, in my experience. Give me specifics, or you'll go back to hanging in the air. I opened the cell door a few days back to feed him. He was dead. How long had it been since you'd fed him, then? Jordan snorted. I don't starve my guests, Lady Aes Sedai. I just encourage them to be free with what they know. And how much encouragement did you give the messenger? Not enough to kill him, the jailer said defensively. Oh, come now, Nynaeve said. The man remained for months in your possession, presumably healthy all that time. Then the day before he is to be brought before the Dragon Reborn, he suddenly dies? You already have my promise of amnesty. Tell me who bribed you to kill him, and I'll see that you're protected. The jailer shook his head. It wasn't like that. I'm telling you, he just died. It happens sometimes. I tire of your games. It's not a game, burn you, Jordan snarled. You think a man could get far in my profession if it were known that he'd accept a bribe to kill one of his guests? You couldn't trust him any further than you could a lying Aiel. She let that last comment slide, though a man like this one could never be trusted. Look, Jordan said, that wasn't the type of prisoner you kill anyway. Everybody wants to know where the king is. Who'd kill the only one with information about it? That man was worth good money. So he's not dead, Nynaeve surmised. Who did you sell him to? Oh, he's dead, the jailer said with a chuckle. If I had sold him, I wouldn't have lived long afterward. You learn that sort of thing quickly, doing what I do. She turned to the other two thugs. Is he lying? She asked of them. 100 gold marks to the one of you who can give me proof that he is. Mord glanced at his boss, then grimaced. For 100 in gold, I'd sell you my own mother, lady. Burn me, but I would. Jurgen's telling the truth, though. That body was good and dead. The dragon's men checked when they brought the lady to us. So Rand had considered that possibility. But she still had no proof that these men were telling her the truth. If there was something to hide, they'd work hard to bury it deep. She decided to try a different path. What did you discover then, she said, about the king's location? Jorgen just sighed. Like I told the Lord Dragon's men, and like I told Lady Chadmar before she landed here in the dungeons herself. That man knew something, but he wouldn't speak it. Come now, Nynaeve said, shooting a glance at the chest with its sharp equipment. She had to look away again before it angered her. A man of your skill? And you couldn't pry one simple fact out of him? Dark One, take me if I'm lying. The jailer's face flushed, as if this were a matter of pride for him. I've never seen a man resist like that one did. A pretty feather of a man like him should have broken without much encouragement at all. But he didn't. He would speak on anything other than the things we wanted. Jorgen leaned forward. I don't know how he did it, lady. Burn me, but I don't. It's like some force had a hold of his tongue. It was like he couldn't talk, even if he'd wanted to. The two thugs muttered to themselves, looking apprehensive. It seemed that Nynaeve's questioning had hit a nerve. So you pushed him too hard, Nynaeve guessed. And that's how he died. Take it all, woman, the jailer growled. Blood and bloody ashes. I didn't kill him. Sometimes people just die. Unfortunately, she was coming to believe him. Jorgen was a wretch of a man who could use a decade doing chores beneath the eyes of a wisdom. But he wasn't lying. So much for her grand plans. She sighed, standing up, realizing just how tired she really was. Light. This scheme was more likely to make Rand explode at her than persuade him to listen to her counsel. She needed to return to the mansion for some sleep. Perhaps tomorrow she'd be able to think up a better way to show Rand that she was on his side. She waved for the guards to take the jailer and his men back up above. After that, she wove air to shut the cell door on Milisaire Chadmon. Nynaeve would see that the woman's conditions were improved. Despicable human being or not, she should not be treated this way. Rand would have to understand that when she explained it to him. Why, Milisaire looked so pale she might be coming down with the shakes. Absently, Nynaeve walked to the viewing slit at the top of the cell door, then wove a delving of spirit to make certain the woman was not ill. As soon as she began the delving, Nynaeve froze. She had expected to find Milisaire's body taxed by exhaustion. She had expected to find disease, perhaps hunger. She had not expected to find poison. Cursing, suddenly alert, Nynaeve threw open the cell door and rushed inside. Yes, she could see it easily through the delving. Parchrot leaf. Nynaeve herself had given that to a hound who had needed to be put down. It was a common enough plant and had a very bitter flavor. Not the best poison, as it had such an unpleasant taste, and yet had to be ingested. Yes, it was a bad poison, unless the person you were poisoning was already captive and had no choice but to eat the food you gave her. Nynaeve began a healing, weaving all 5 powers, strangling the poison and strengthening Milisaire's body. It was a relatively easy healing, as Tarchrot leaf wasn't particularly strong. You either had to use a lot of it, as she had with the hound, or you had to administer it several times for it to take effect. But if you did it slowly like that, the person you killed with it would seem to die naturally. Once Milisaire was safe, Nynaeve burst from the cell. "Stop!" she bellowed at the men. "Jorgen!" Lurtz at the back turned with surprise. He grabbed the jailer Jorgen by the arm and spun him around. "Who prepares the prisoner's food?" Nynaeve demanded, stalking toward him. "Food?" Jorgen asked, looking confused. "That's one of Curb's jobs." "Why?" "Curb? The lad," Jorgen said. "Nobody important. An apprentice we found among the refugees a few months back. Quite a lucky find. Our last apprentice ran off on us, and this one was already trained in..." Nynaeve hushed him with a raised hand, suddenly anxious. "The boy, where is he?" "He was just here," Lurtz said, glancing up. "Went with..." There was a sudden scrambling from above. Nynaeve cursed, calling for Triben to catch the boy. She shoved her way to the ladder and began climbing. She darted out into the shop above, her glowing light following. The 2 thugs stood cowering in the center room, looking confused, and a Saldean guard stood with a sword pulled on them. He looked at her questioningly. "The boy," she said. Triben glanced toward the shop door. It was open. Preparing weaves of air, Nynaeve dashed out onto the street. There she found the boy, Curb, in the muddy street, held down by the 4 dice-playing workers she'd brought from the mansion. Even as she stepped off the boardwalk onto the street, they pulled the struggling, frantic boy to his feet. The last Saldean stood at the doorway, sword out, as if he'd been rushing in to see if she was in danger. "He bolted out the door, Aes Sedai," one of the workers said. "As if the Dark One himself was chasing him. Your soldier ran over to see if you were in danger, but we figured it would be best to snatch this lad before he could get away. Just in case." Nynaeve let out a breath to calm herself. "You did well," she said. The youth struggled weakly. "You did well, indeed." Chapter 33. A conversation with the dragon. "This," Rand declared, "had better be important." Nynaeve turned to find the dragon reborn standing in the doorway to the sitting room. He wore a dark red robe with black dragons embroidered up the arms. His stump was hidden in the folds of the left sleeve. Though his hair was tousled from sleep, his eyes were alert. He strode into the sitting room, ever the king. Even now, long after midnight and just awakened, he walked as if he were absolutely certain of himself. Some servants had brought a pot of hot tea, and he filled a cup as Min followed him into the room. She also wore a sleeping robe. The robes were one of the fashions of the Damani, and hers was of yellow silk, the weave far thinner than Rand's. Aiel maidens took up positions by the door, lounging in their strangely dangerous way. Rand took a gulp from his cup. It was getting harder and harder to see in him the boy Nynaeve had known in the Two Rivers. Had his jaw always been set with those lines of determination? When had his step grown so sure, his posture so demanding? This man almost seemed an interpretation of the Rand she'd once known, like a statue carved from rock to look like him but exaggerated in heroic lines. "Well?" Rand demanded. "Who is this?" The young apprentice, Curb, sat tied in air upon one of the room's cushioned benches. Nynaeve glanced at him, then embraced the source, and wove a ward against eavesdropping. Rand looked at her sharply. "You channeled?" he asked. He could sense when she did so without taking precautions. He felt goosebumps on the flesh, according to Egwene and Elaine's investigations. "A ward," she said, refusing to be cowed. "Last I checked, I didn't need your permission to channel. You've grown high and mighty, Rand al'Thor, but don't forget that I paddled your backside when you were barely as tall as a man's shins." Once, that would have gotten a reaction from him, if only a huff of annoyance. Now he just looked at her. Those eyes of his seemed at times the part of him that had changed the most. He sighed. "Why have you wakened me, Nynaeve? Who is this spindly, terrified youth? If it had been anyone else who sent that message this time of night, I'd have sent them to Bashir for a flogging." Nynaeve nodded at Curb. "I think this spindly, terrified youth knows where the king is." That got Rand's attention, and Min's as well. She'd poured herself a cup of tea and was leaning against a wall. Why weren't they married? "The king?" Rand asked. "Grandal too, then. How do you know this, Nynaeve? Where did you find him?" "At the dungeon where you sent Milisair Chadmar," Nynaeve said, eyeing him. "It is terrible, Rand al'Thor. You have no right to treat a person in such a manner." He didn't rise to that comment either. Instead, he simply walked over to Curb. "He heard something from the interrogation?" "No," Nynaeve said. "But I think he killed the messenger. I know for a fact that he tried to poison Milisair. She'd have been dead by the end of the week if I hadn't healed her." Rand glanced at Nynaeve, and she could almost feel him connecting the comments to figure out what she had been doing. "You Aes Sedai," he finally said, "share much with rats, I've come to realize. You are always in places where you are not wanted." Nynaeve snorted. "If I'd stayed away, then Milisair would be dying and Curb would be free." "I assume you've asked him who ordered him to kill the messenger?" "Not yet," Nynaeve said. "I did find the poison among his things, however.
Oh shit, hell yeah.
He had
You definitely
prepared
be
food
safe on your
both
way
for
home.
Milisair and the
Sorry.
messenger." She hesitated before continuing. "Rand, I'm not certain that he'll be able to answer our questions. I delved him, and while he's not sick physically, there's something there in his mind." "What do you mean?" Rand asked softly. "A block of some sort," Nynaeve said. The jailer seemed frustrated, even surprised that the messenger had been able to resist his questioning. "I think there must have been some block on that man, too. Something to keep him from revealing too much." "Compulsion," Rand said. He spoke offhandedly, raising his tea to his lips. Compulsion was dark, evil. She'd felt it herself. She still shivered when she considered what Moghedien had done to her. And that had been only a small thing, removing some memories. "Few are as skilled with compulsion as Grandal," Rand said musingly. "Perhaps this is the confirmation I've been looking for." "Yes. This could be a great discovery indeed, Nynaeve. Great enough to make me forget how you obtained it." Rand rounded the bench and leaned down to meet the young man's eyes. "Release him," Rand commanded her. She complied. "Tell me," Rand said to Curb, "who told you to poison those people?" I don't know anything, the boy squeaked. I just stopped, Rand said softly. Do you believe that I can kill you? The boy fell silent, and, though Nynaeve wouldn't have thought it possible, his blue eyes opened wider. Do you believe that if I simply said the word, Rand continued in his eerie, quiet voice, your heart would stop beating? I am the dragon reborn. Do you believe that I can take your life or your soul itself if I so much as will it to happen? Nynaeve saw it again, the patina of darkness around Rand, that aura that she couldn't quite be certain was there. She raised her tea to her lips and found that it had suddenly grown bitter and stale, as if it had been left to sit too long. Curb slouched down and began to cry. Speak, Rand commanded. The youth opened his mouth, but only a groan came out. He was so transfixed by Rand that he didn't or couldn't blink the sweat from his eyes. Yes, Rand said thoughtfully. This is compulsion, Nynaeve. She's here. I was right. He looked at Nynaeve. You will have to unravel the web of compulsion, wipe it from his mind before he can tell us what he knows. What? She asked incredulously. I have little skill with this kind of weaving, Rand said with a wave of his hand. I suspect that you can remove compulsion if you try. It is similar to healing in a way. Use the same weave that creates compulsion, but reverse it. She frowned. Healing the poor boy sounded like a fine idea. Every wound should be healed, after all. But trying something she'd never done before and doing so in front of Rand was not appealing. What if she did it wrong and somehow hurt the boy? Rand sat down on the cushioned bench seat across from the youth, Min walking over to sit beside him. She was regarding her tea with a grimace. Apparently hers had spoiled as suddenly as Nynaeve's had. Rand watched Nynaeve, waiting. Rand, just try it, Rand said. I can't tell you how it is done specifically, not for a woman, but you're clever. I'm certain you can manage. His unintentionally patronizing tone sent her back into a rage. Being as tired as she was didn't help. She gritted her teeth, turning toward Curb, and wove all 5 powers. His eyes darted back and forth, though he couldn't see the weaves. Nynaeve laid a very light healing across him, causing him to stiffen. She wove a separate line of spirit, delving into his head as delicately as she could, prodding at the weaves that clumped across his mind. Yes, she could see it now. A complex web made from lines of spirit, air, and water. It was horrible looking at it with her mind's eye, crisscrossing the youth's brain. Bits of the weave touched here and there like tiny hooks, jutting deep into the brain itself. Reverse the weave, Rand had said. That was far from easy. She'd have to pull the web of compulsion off layer by layer, and if she made a mistake, she could very easily kill him. She almost backed away. But who else was there? Compulsion was a forbidden weave, and she doubted that Kirill or the others had any experience with it. If Nynaeve stopped now, Rand would just send for the others and ask them to do it. They'd obey him, laughing behind their hands at Nynaeve, the accepted who thought herself a full-eyed Sedai. Well, she had discovered new ways of healing. She had helped cleanse the taint from the one power itself. She had healed stilling and gentling. She could do this. She worked quickly, weaving a mirror image of the first layer of compulsion. Each use of the power was exact, but reversed from the pattern already woven in the boy's mind. Nynaeve laid her weave down carefully, hesitantly, and as Rand had said, both puffed away and vanished. How had he known? She shivered, thinking of what Semirhage had said about him. Memories from another life. Memories he had no right to. There was a reason the Creator allowed them to forget their past lives. No man should have to remember the failures of Luz Theron Telamon. She continued, layer after layer, stripping away the compulsion's weaves like a hedge doctor removing bandages from a wounded leg. It was exhausting work, but fulfilling. Each weave fixed a wrong, healed the youth a little more, made something just a hair more right in the world. It took the better part of an hour and was a grueling experience, but she did it. As the last layer of compulsion vanished, she let out an exhausted sigh and released the one power, convinced that she couldn't channel a single thread more if it were to save her life. She wobbled over to a chair and slumped down. Min, she noticed, had curled up on the bench seat beside Ran and had fallen asleep. But he did not sleep. The Dragon Reborn watched, as if seeing things Nynaeve could not. He stood up and walked to Curb. In her dizzied state, Nynaeve hadn't noticed the young Chandler's face. It was oddly blank, like that of a person dazed from a strong blow to the head. Rand lowered himself to one knee, cradling the youth's chin in his hand, staring into his eyes. "Where?" he asked softly. "Where is she?" The youth opened his mouth, and a line of drool leaked out the side of it. "Where is she?" Rand repeated. Curb moaned, eyes still blank, tongue parting his lips just slightly. "Rand," Nynaeve said, "stop it. What are you doing to him?" "I have done nothing," Rand said quietly, not looking toward her. "This is what you did, Nynaeve, in unraveling those weaves. Grendal's compulsions are powerful, but crude in some ways. She fills a mind with compulsion to such an extent as to erase personality and intellect, leaving behind a puppet who works only according to her direct commands." "But he was able to interact just moments ago." Rand shook his head. "If you ask the men at the jail, they'll tell you this one was slow of thought and rarely spoke to them. There was no real person in this head, only layered weaves of compulsion, instructions cleverly designed to wipe whatever personality this poor wretch had and replace it with a creature who would act exactly as Grendal wished. I've seen it dozens of times." "Dozens of times?" Nynaeve thought with a shiver. "You've seen it? Or Luz Therin saw it? Which memories rule you right now?" She looked at Curb, sick to her stomach. His eyes weren't blank from being dazed as she'd thought. They were more empty than that. When Nynaeve had been younger, new to her role as wisdom, a woman had been brought to her who had fallen off of her wagon. The woman had slept for days, and when she'd finally awoken, she'd had a stare like this one. No hint that she recognized anyone. No clue that there was any soul left in the husk that was her body. She'd died about a week later. Rand spoke to Curb again. "I need a location," Rand said. "Something. If there is any vestige within you that resisted, any scrap that fought her, I promise you revenge. A location. Where is she?" Spittle dripped from the boy's lips. They seemed to quiver. Rand stood up, looming, still holding the youth's eyes with his own. Curb shivered, then whispered 2 words. "Natrins Barrow." Rand exhaled softly, then released Curb with an almost reverent motion. The youth slipped from the bench to the floor, spittle drooling from his lips onto the rug. Nynaeve cursed, leaping from her seat, then wobbling slightly as the room spun. Like she was exhausted. She steadied herself, closed her eyes, and took a few deep breaths. Then she knelt at the boy's side. "You needn't bother," Rand said. "He's dead." Nynaeve confirmed the death for herself. Then she snapped her head up, looking at Rand. What right did he have to look as exhausted as she felt? He had done barely anything. "What did you—" "I did nothing, Nynaeve. I suspect that once you removed that compulsion, the only thing keeping him alive was his anger at Grendal buried deeply. Whatever bit of himself remained, it knew the only help it could give were those 2 words. After that, he just let go. There was nothing more we could do for him." "I don't accept that," Nynaeve said, frustrated. He could have been healed. She should have been able to help him. Undoing Grendal's compulsion had felt so good, so right. It shouldn't have ended this way. She shuddered, feeling dirtied, used. How was she better than the jailer who had done such horrible things for information? She glared at Rand. He could have told her what removing compulsion would do. Don't look at me like that, Nynaeve. He walked to the door and gestured for the maidens there to collect Curb's body. They did so, carrying it away as Rand called softly for a new pot of tea. He returned, sitting down on the bench beside the sleeping Min. She'd tucked one of the bench's pillows under her head. One of the 2 lamps in the room was burning low, and that left his face half in shadow. This was the only way it could have happened, he continued. The wheel weaves as the wheel wills. You are Aes Sedai. Is that not one of your creeds? I don't know what it is, Nynaeve snapped, but it's not an excuse for your actions. What actions? He asked. You brought this man to me. Grendal used compulsion on him. Now I will kill her for it. That action will be my sole responsibility. Now let me be. I shall try to go back to sleep. Don't you feel any guilt at all? She demanded. They locked eyes. Nynaeve, frustrated and helpless. Rand. Who could guess what Rand felt these days? Should I suffer for them all, Nynaeve? He asked quietly, rising, face still half in the darkness. Lay this death at my feet, if you wish. It will just be one of many. How many stones can you pile on a man's body before the weight stops mattering? How far can you burn a lump of flesh until further heat is irrelevant? If I let myself feel guilt for this boy, then I would need to feel guilt for the others, and it would crush me. She regarded him in the half-light. A king, certainly. A soldier, though he had only occasionally seen war. She forced down her anger. Hadn't this all been about proving to him that he could trust her? Oh, Rand, she said, turning away. This thing you have become, the heart without any emotion but anger. It will destroy you. Yes, he said softly. She looked back at him, shocked. I continue to wonder, he said, glancing down at Min, why you all assume that I am too dense to see what you find so obvious. Yes, Nynaeve. Yes, this hardness will destroy me. I know. Then why, she asked, why won't you let us help you? He looked up, staring off at nothing. A servant knocked quietly, wearing the white and forest green of Elisair's house. She entered and deposited the new pot of tea, picked up the old one, then withdrew. When I was much younger, he said, voice soft, Tam told me of a story he'd heard while traveling the world. He spoke of Dragonmount. I didn't know at the time that he'd actually seen it, nor that he had found me there. I was just a shepherd boy, and Dragonmount, Tar Valon, and Caemlyn were almost mythical places to me. He told me of it, though. A mountain so high it made even Twinhorn's Peak back home seem a dwarf. Tam's stories claimed no man had ever climbed to Dragonmount's peak. Not because it was impossible, but because
Speaking of stones,
the
sorry.
ounce of strength a man had. So tall was the mountain that besting it would be a struggle that drained a man completely. He fell silent. So, Nynaeve finally asked. He looked at her. Don't you see? The stories claimed no man had climbed the mountain because in doing so he would be without strength to return. A mountaineer could best it, reach the top, see what no man had ever seen, but then he would die. The strongest and wisest explorers knew this, so they never climbed it. They always wanted to, but they waited, reserving that trip for another day, for they knew it would be their last. That's just a story, Nynaeve said. A legend. That's what I am, Rand said. A story. A legend. To be told to children years from now, spoken of in whispers. He shook his head. Sometimes you can't turn back. You have to keep pressing on. And sometimes you know this climb is
Let's do one more dab.
You all claim that I've grown too hard, that I will inevitably shatter and break if I continue on. But you assume that there needs to be something left of me to continue on, that I need to climb back down the mountain once I've reached the top. That's the key, Wendy. I see it now. I will not live through this, and so I don't need to worry about what might happen to me after the last battle. I don't need to hold back. Don't need to salvage anything of this beaten-up soul of mine. I know that I must die. Those who wish for me to be softer, willing to bend, are those who cannot accept what will happen to me. He looked down at Min again. Many times before, Nynaeve had seen affection in his eyes when he regarded her, but this time they were blank, set in that same emotionless face. We can find a way, Rand, Nynaeve said. Surely there is a way to win, but also let you live. No, he growled softly. Do not tempt me down that path again. It only leads to pain, Nynaeve. I used to think about leaving something behind to help the world survive once I died, but that was a struggle to keep living. I can't indulge myself. I'll climb this bloody mountain and face the sun. You all will deal with what comes next. That is how it must be. She opened her mouth to object again, but he gave her a sharp glance. That is how it must be, Nynaeve. She closed her mouth. You did well tonight, Rand said. You have saved us all a lot of trouble. I did it because I want you to trust me, said Nynaeve, then immediately cursed herself. Why had she said that? Was she really so tired that she blabbed the first thing that came to her mind? Rand just nodded. I do trust you, Nynaeve. As much as I trust anyone, more than I trust most. You think you know what is best for me, even against my wishes. That is something I can accept. The difference between you and Kedswain is that you actually care about me. She only cares about my place in her plans. She wants me to be part of the last battle. You want me to live. For that, you have my thanks. Dream on my behalf, Nynaeve. Dream for things I no longer can. He leaned down to pick up Min. He managed it despite his missing hand, snaking one arm underneath her and gripping with his hand as he lifted her up. She stirred, then snuggled in close to him, waking and murmuring a complaint that she could walk. He didn't put her down, perhaps because of the exhaustion in her voice. Nynaeve knew she stayed up with her books most nights, pushing herself almost as hard as Rand did. Carrying Min, he walked toward the door. We will deal with the Shanshan first, he said. Be well prepared for that meeting. I will take care of Grendal soon after. He left her then. Finally gave out. The one on the table. Rand had surprised her again. He was still a wool-headed fool, but he was a surprisingly self-aware one. How could a man understand so much, yet still be so ignorant? And why couldn't she come up with an argument against what he'd said? Why couldn't she make herself yell at him that he was wrong? There was always hope. By surrendering that most important emotion, he might make himself strong, but risked losing all reason he might have to care about the outcome of his battles. For some reason, she couldn't find words for the argument.
Chapter 34. Legends. All right, that said, unrolling one of Roydell's best maps on his table. Tomanus, Tom, Noel, Julian, and Mandelwyn had arranged their chairs around the table. Beside the map of the area, Matt unrolled a sketch of the layout of a medium-sized town. It had taken some doing to find a merchant willing to sketch them a map of Trustair, but after Hinder's tap, Matt didn't like to go into a town without knowing what they were up against. Matt's pavilion was shaded by the pine forest outside, and the day was cool. Occasionally, the wind would blow, and a small sprinkle of dead pine needles would shake free from the boughs above and fall to the ground, some scratching the top of the tent as they fell. Outside, soldiers called to one another, and pots clanged as the midday meal was distributed. Matt studied the town map. It was time to stop being a fool. The whole world had decided to turn against him. Even rural mountain towns were death traps these days. Next he knew, the daisies on the sides of the road would begin ganging up to try and eat him. That thought gave him pause as he remembered the poor peddler sinking into the phantom Shiatan town. When that ghostly place had vanished, it had left behind a meadow with butterflies and flowers, including daisies. Burn me, he thought. Well, Matt from Cawthon wasn't about to end up dead on some random backwater road. This time he would plan, and he would be ready. He nodded to himself in satisfaction. The inn is here, Matt said, pointing at the town map. The Shaken Fist. 2 separate travelers agreed that it was a fine inn, the nicest of the 3 in the town. The woman looking for me hasn't made any effort to hide her whereabouts, so that means she thinks that she is well protected. We can expect guards. Matt pulled out another of Roydell's maps, one that better showed the geography around Trustair. The town sat in a small hollow, surrounded by gently rolling hills, beside a small lake fed by Highland springs. The lake reportedly produced some fine trout, the salting of which was the town's main trade. I want 3 squads of light cavalry here, Matt said, pointing at an upper slope. They'll be hidden by the trees, but will have full view of the skies. If a red night flower goes up, they're to come in directly along the main road here for a rescue. We'll have 100 crossbowmen sequestered on either side of the town as a backup to the cavalry. If the night flower is green instead, the cavalry is to march in and secure the main roads to the town here, here, and here. Matt looked up, pointing at Tom. Tom, you'll take Harnan, Bergen, and Mandevwin as apprentices, and Noel can be your footman. Footman? Noel asked. He was a gnarled man, missing teeth, with a hooked beak of a nose, but he was tough as an old battle-scored sword passed down from father to son. Why does Leman need a footman? All right, Matt said. You can be his brother then, who doubles as a manservant. Julian, you... Oh, wait, Matt, Mandevwin said, scratching his face near his eye patch. I'm to be an apprentice gleeman? I'm not certain my voice is suited to fine singing. You've heard me, I warrant. And with only one eye, I doubt I'll fare well at juggling. You're a new apprentice, Matt said. Tom knows you don't have any talent, but he took pity on you because your great aunt, with whom you've lived since your parents died in a tragic oxen stampede, took sick of the clover pox and went crazy. She started feeding you table scraps and treated you like the family hound, Marks, who'd run away when you were just 7. Mandevwin scratched his head. His hair was streaked with gray. Aren't I a little old to be an apprentice, though? Nonsense, Matt said. You're young at heart, and since you never married, the only woman you ever loved ran away with the tanner's son, Tom's arrival offered you an opportunity to start fresh. But I don't want to leave my great aunt, Mandevwin protested. She's cared for me since I was a child. It's not honest of a man to abandon an elderly woman just because she gets a little confused. There is no great aunt, Matt said with exasperation. This is just a legend, a story to go with your false name. Can't I have a story that makes me more honorable? Mandevwin asked. Too late, Matt said, rifling through a stack on his desk, searching out a cluster of 5 pages covered in scrawled handwriting. You can't change now. I spent half the night working on your story. It's the best out of the lot. Here, memorize this. He handed it over to Mandevwin, then got out another stack of papers and began looking through them. Are you sure you're not taking this a little too far, lad? Tom asked. I'm not going to be surprised again, Tom, Matt said. Burn me, but I'm not going to let it happen. I'm tired of walking into traps unprepared. I plan to take command of my own destiny and stop running from problem to problem. It's time to be in charge. And you do that with, Julian said. Elaborate aliases with backstories, Matt said, handing Tom and Noel their sheets. Bloody right I do. What about me? Tilmanis asked. That twinkle to his eyes was back, though he spoke with a completely earnest voice. Let me guess, Matt. I'm a traveling merchant who once trained with the Aiel and who has come to the village because he's heard there's a trout that lives in the lake who insulted his father. Nonsense, Matt said, handing him his sheets. You're a warder. That's rather suspicious, Tilmanis noted. You're supposed to be suspicious, Matt said. It's always easier to beat a man in cards when he thinks about something else. Well, you'll be our something else. A warder passing through town on mysterious business won't be so grand an event that it will draw too much attention, but to those who know what to look for, it will be a good distraction. You can use Fenn's cloak. He said he'd let me borrow it. He still feels guilty for letting those serving women get away. Of course, you didn't tell him that they simply vanished, Tom added, and that there was no way for him to keep it from happening. Didn't see the point of telling him, Matt said. No use dwelling in the past, I say. A warder, is it? Tilmanis said, flipping through his stack of papers. I'll have to practice scowling. Matt regarded him with a flat expression. You're not taking this seriously. What did you ask? Is there someone who is taking this seriously? Burn that twinkle. Had Matt really ever thought this man was slow to laugh? He just did it on the inside. That was the most infuriating way. Like Tilmanis, Matt said. A woman in that town is looking for Perrin and me. She knows what we look like so well that she can produce a drawing more accurate than my own mother could have made. That gives me a chill like the Dark One himself standing over my shoulder. And I can't go into the flaming place myself, since every bloody man, woman, and child has a picture with my face on it and a promise of gold for information. Now, maybe I went a little far with the preparations, but I intend to find this person before they can order a flock of dark friends, or worse, to cut my throat in the night. Understood? Matt looked each of the 5 men in the eyes, nodded, and started toward the tent flap, but paused beside Tilmanis' chair. Matt cleared his throat, then half mumbled, You secretly harbor a love of painting, and you wish you could escape this life of death you've committed yourself to. You came through Trustare on your way south rather than taking a more direct route because you love the mountains. You're hoping to hear word of your younger brother, whom you haven't seen in years, and who disappeared on a hunting trip in southern Andor. You have a very tortured past. Read page 4. Matt hurried on, pushing his way out into the shaded noon, though he did catch a glimpse of Tilmanis rolling his eyes. Burn the man. There was good drama in those pages. Through the pine trees, he could see that the sky was cloudy. Again. When was that going to end? Matt shook his head as he walked through camp, nodding to the groups of soldiers who offered him salutes or calls of greeting to Lord Matt. The band were staying here for the day, camped on a secluded wooded hillside, a half-day march from the town, while they made final preparations for the assault. The three-needle pines here were tall, and their limbs spread wide, the shade keeping underbrush to a minimum. Tents clustered in groups around the pines, and the air was cool and shaded, smelling of sap and loam. He went about the camp, checking into the workings of his men, and seeing that everything was being handled efficiently. Those old memories, the ones that the eel fin had given him, had begun to blend so evenly with his own that he could barely tell which instincts came from them and which were his own. It was good to be among the band again. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed them. It would be nice to reunite with the rest of the men, the troops led by Estion and Darad. Hopefully, they'd had an easier time of it than Matt's force had. The cavalry banners came first in his rounds. They were separate from the rest of the camp. Horsemen always considered themselves superior to foot. Today, as all too often, the men were worried about feed for their horses. To a good cavalryman, his horse always came first. Their trip from Hinderstap had been hard on the animals, particularly since there wasn't much to graze on. Little was growing this spring, and the winter's leavings were strangely sparse. Horses would refuse patches of thatch, almost as if it had gone bad like other food stores. They didn't have much grain. They had hoped to live off the land, as they were moving too quickly for grain wagons. Well, they'd just have to find something to do about that. Matt assured the cavalrymen he was working on the problem, and they took him at his word. Lord Matt hadn't let them down yet. Of course, the ones he had let down were rotting in their graves. They denied a request to fly the banner, perhaps after the raid on Trustare. He didn't have any true foot with him at the moment. They were all with Estion and Darad. Talmanas had wisely understood that they'd need mobility and had brought the 3 banners of horse and nearly 4,000 mounted crossbowmen. Matt checked on the crossbowmen next, pausing to watch a couple of squads drilling in firing ranks at the back of the camp. Matt stopped beside a tall pine, its low branches a good 2 feet above his head, leaning against the trunk. The line of crossbowmen weren't practicing their aim so much as their coordination. You didn't really aim in most battles, which was why the crossbows worked so well. They required 1/10 the training of a longbow. Sure, the latter could fire faster and farther, but if you didn't have a lifetime to spare practicing, then these crossbows were a fine substitute. Besides, the crossbow reloading process made it easier to train the ranks to fire together. The squad's captain stood on the far side, slapping a rod against the side of the tree once every 2 seconds to give a beat. Each crack of the wood was an order. Raise crossbows to the shoulder on the first, fire on the second, lower on the third, crank on the fourth, up to the shoulder again on the fifth. The men were getting good. Firing in coordinated waves made for more consistent killing. Each 4th crack let loose a wave of bolts into the trees. We'll need more of those, Matt thought, noticing how many of the bolts splintered during the training shots. You wasted more ammunition practicing than you did fighting, but each bolt now could be worth 2 or 3 in combat. The men were getting good indeed. If he'd had a few banners worth of these when he'd fought at Bloodwash Falls, perhaps Nashif would have learned his lesson a lot sooner. Of course, they'd be more useful if they could fire faster. The cranking was the slow point. Not the turn of the crank itself, but the necessity of lowering the crossbow each time. It cost 4 seconds just to move the weapon about. These new cranks and boxes that Talmanas had learned to make from that mechanic in Urandy sped things up greatly. But the mechanic had been on his way to sell the cranks in Camelin, and who knew who else had bought them along the way. Before too long, everyone might have them. An advantage was negated if both you and your enemies had it. Those boxes had given a lot to Matt's success in Altara against the Shonchan. He was loath to surrender the advantage. Could he find a way to make the bows fire even faster? Thoughtful, he checked on a few more things in the camp. The Altarans they'd recruited into the band were settling in well, and other than feed for the horses and perhaps crossbow bolts, supplies looked good. Satisfied, he went looking for Aludra. She had established herself near the back of the camp alongside a little cleft in the rocky hillside. Though this spot was much smaller than the glade of trees the Aes Sedai and their attendants used, it was noticeably more secluded. Matt had to weave around 3 separate cloth sheets hanging between trees, placed carefully to block any view into Aludra's workspace, before he reached her. And he had to stop when Bail Doman held out a hand, holding Matt back until Aludra gave leave for him to enter. The slender, dark-haired illuminator sat on a stump in the center of her little camp, powders, rolls of paper, a writing board for notes and tools neatly arranged on strips of cloth on the ground around her. She no longer wore her braids, and her long hair fell loose around her shoulders. That made her look odd to Matt. Still pretty, though. "Burn it, Matt, you're married now," he told himself. Aludra was pretty, though. Egainan was there, holding a nightflower shell upright for Aludra to work on. Aludra's full-lipped face frowned in concentration as she tapped lightly on the shell. Egainan's dark hair was growing out, making her look less and less like one of the Shonchan nobility. Matt still had trouble trying to decide what to call the woman. She wanted to be known as Lylewyn, and sometimes he thought of her like that. It was foolish to go about changing her name just because someone said you had to, but he didn't really blame her for not wanting to rile Tuon. She was a bloody stubborn one, Tuon was. He found himself glancing to the south again, but caught himself. Blood and ashes, she'd be just fine. Anyway, Tuon was gone now. So why did Egainan continue the charade of calling herself Lylewyn? Matt had actually called her by her old name once or twice after Tuon's departure, but had received a curt reprimand. Women. They made no sense, and Shonchan women least of all. Matt glanced at Bail Doman. The muscular, bearded Illianer leaned against a tree near the entrance to Aludra's camp, 2 flapping white sheets of cloth extending in either direction near him. He still held out a warning hand, as if this entire camp weren't Matt's in the first place. Matt didn't push his way past, though. He couldn't afford to offend Aludra. She was flaming close to being done with those dragon designs of hers, and he meant to have those. But light of it didn't smart to have to pass a checkpoint in his own camp. Aludra looked up from her work, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. She noted Matt, then looked back to her nightflower and began tapping with the hammer again. Bloody ashes. Seeing that reminded him why he visited Aludra so infrequently. The checkpoint was bad enough, but did the woman have to pound on something explosive with a hammer? Had she no sense at all? The entire lot of illuminators was that way, though. Short a few foals of a full herd, as Matt's father might say. "He may enter," Aludra said. "Thank you, Master Doman." "It do be a pleasure, Mistress Aludra said, looked over and nodding amiably to Matt. Matt straightened his coat and walked forward, intent on...
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.